The call that changed everything. The snow fell like broken promises over Detroit, Michigan, on the night that changed 3 lives forever. Detective Michael Hayes stood in the precinct parking lot, watching the flakes accumulate on his windshield while he tried to process the phone call he'd just received. His daughter Emma, 24 years old and studying social work at Wayne State University, had been kidnapped by a man named Vincent Carrera, a drug dealer Hayes had helped put away 5 years earlier. Emma Hayes had always been her father's pride and joy. While other cops' kids rebelled against their parents' profession, Emma had been inspired by Michael's dedication to protecting others. She volunteered at homeless shelters, worked with at-risk youth, and planned to dedicate her career to helping people escape the cycles of poverty and violence that trapped so many in Detroit's struggling neighborhoods. The irony was devastating. Emma's compassion and desire to help others had led her directly into danger. She had been working late at a community center in one of Detroit's most troubled areas, helping teenagers with their homework and providing mentorship to kids who had nowhere else to turn. It was exactly the kind of work that made Michael proud of his daughter, and exactly the kind of work that had made her vulnerable to someone seeking revenge. Vincent Carrera had been released from prison just 3 weeks earlier, after serving 5 years for drug trafficking and assault. Michael remembered the case clearly. Carrera had been running a sophisticated operation that sold heroin and fentanyl to teenagers throughout the Detroit metro area. When Michael's investigation had finally brought Carrera down, the dealer had sworn vengeance against the detective who had destroyed his business and taken 5 years of his life. The phone call had been brief and terrifying. Carrera's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he explained that he had Emma and that Michael had 1 hour to meet him at an abandoned warehouse on the city's east side. The terms were simple: Michael would come alone, unarmed, and ready to trade his life for his daughter's. Any attempt to involve other law enforcement officers would result in Emma's immediate death. Michael knew it was a trap. His 25 years of experience in law enforcement told him that Carrera had no intention of letting either of them survive the encounter. But Emma was his only child, the most important thing in his world, and he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to save her, even if it meant sacrificing his own life in the process. Chapter 2: A Father's Love and a Daughter's Dream. Emma Hayes had grown up understanding both the importance and the dangers of her father's work. Michael had never hidden the realities of police work from his daughter, believing that honesty was the best way to help her understand why he sometimes came home late, why he sometimes seemed distracted by the weight of what he'd seen, and why he worried constantly about her safety in a world that could be cruel and unpredictable. After Emma's mother, Sarah, had died of cancer when Emma was 16, the bond between father and daughter had grown even stronger. Michael had been both parent and protector, supporting Emma through her grief while dealing with his own devastating loss. Sarah had been the heart of their family, a kindergarten teacher whose optimism and kindness had balanced Michael's sometimes cynical worldview shaped by years of seeing humanity at its worst. Emma had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and her father's determination to make a difference in the world. She excelled in her studies, majoring in social work with a minor in criminal justice, planning to work with at-risk youth and families affected by violence and addiction. Emma understood that the problems plaguing Detroit and similar cities across America were complex, rooted in decades of economic decline, systemic racism, and the failure of institutions to provide adequate support for struggling communities. The community center where Emma volunteered was located in a neighborhood that had been devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and years of municipal neglect. Many of the teenagers Emma worked with had been exposed to violence, drugs, and trauma that would have broken adults. Yet Emma saw potential in each of them, refusing to give up on kids that society had written off as hopeless cases. Michael had initially been concerned about Emma working in such a dangerous area, but he had come to admire his daughter's courage and commitment. Emma took reasonable precautions. She never worked alone, always parked in well-lit areas, and maintained constant communication with the center's security staff. But her desire to help others sometimes overrode her caution, and on the night she was taken, Emma had stayed late to help a teenager who was struggling with family problems at home. Vincent Carrera had been watching the community center for weeks, studying Emma's routine and waiting for the right opportunity. He knew that taking Michael's daughter would cause the detective more pain than any physical torture could inflict, and he planned to savor every moment of the revenge he had been planning for 5 years. Chapter 3, The Weight of the Past. Vincent Carrera's hatred for Detective Michael Hayes went far beyond simple revenge for his imprisonment. The drug trafficking operation that Michael had dismantled had been Carrera's way of supporting not just himself, but his younger sister Maria, who had been struggling with addiction and needed expensive treatment that their family couldn't afford through legitimate means. When Michael's investigation had led to Carrera's arrest and the seizure of his assets, Maria had been left without the financial support she needed for rehabilitation. She had overdosed on contaminated heroin just 6 months after her brother's incarceration, dying alone in an abandoned building while Vincent sat in a prison cell, powerless to help her. In Vincent's mind, Michael Hayes was directly responsible for Maria's death, and he had spent 5 years in prison planning elaborate revenge scenarios. The irony of Vincent's quest for vengeance was that his drug dealing had contributed to the same kind of tragedy he blamed Michael for causing. The heroin and fentanyl that Vincent had sold to teenagers throughout Detroit had destroyed dozens of families, creating addicts who would go on to commit crimes to support their habits, spreading violence and desperation throughout the community. But grief and rage had blinded Vincent to his own culpability, allowing him to see himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Michael understood the cycles of violence and revenge that plagued communities like Detroit. He had seen how trauma and loss could transform ordinary people into criminals, how desperation could drive good people to make terrible choices, and how the desire for vengeance could consume lives and destroy families. But understanding the causes of violence didn't make it any easier to deal with when it threatened the person he loved most in the world. As Michael drove through the snowy streets toward the abandoned warehouse where Vincent was holding Emma, he thought about all the cases he had worked over the years, all the families that had been torn apart by violence and addiction. He had always believed that his work made a difference, that putting criminals behind bars helped protect innocent people from harm. But now his own family was paying the price for his dedication to justice, and he wondered if anything he had accomplished was worth the risk to his daughter's life. The warehouse district on Detroit's east side was a graveyard of American industrial might, filled with empty buildings that had once housed thriving businesses and provided good-paying jobs for thousands of workers. Now these structures served as hideouts for criminals, shooting galleries for drug addicts, and symbols of a city's struggle to reinvent itself in the face of economic devastation. Chapter 4, The Confrontation. Michael arrived at the warehouse 15 minutes early, using the extra time to survey the area and look for any advantage he might have in the coming confrontation. The building was massive, a former automotive parts factory that had been abandoned for over a decade. Broken windows stared like empty eyes from the brick facade, and snow had drifted against the loading docks where trucks had once brought raw materials and carried away finished products. Vincent had chosen the location carefully. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by other abandoned buildings that would muffle any sounds of violence. There were multiple entrances and exits, making it difficult for law enforcement to surround the building effectively. And the interior was a maze of corridors, offices, and production areas that would give Vincent numerous opportunities to ambush anyone trying to rescue Emma. Michael knew he should call for backup, should follow department protocol and treat this as a hostage situation requiring SWAT intervention and negotiation specialists. But Vincent had been clear about the consequences of involving other officers, and Michael couldn't risk Emma's life by following procedures that might get her killed. He was going into this confrontation alone, armed only with his service weapon and 25 years of experience dealing with dangerous criminals. The snow continued to fall as Michael approached the warehouse's main entrance, each step feeling like it might be his last. He thought about Emma's childhood, remembering the countless bedtime stories he had read to her, the soccer games he had attended, the proud moment when she had graduated from high school as valedictorian. He thought about Sarah and wondered if he would see his wife again soon, if death would reunite their family or simply end his chance to save his daughter. Vincent was waiting in the warehouse's main production area, a cavernous space filled with rusted machinery and debris. Emma was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face pale but her eyes defiant. She had inherited her father's courage along with her mother's compassion, and even in this terrifying situation, she was trying to project strength and calm. "Detective Hayes," Vincent called out as Michael entered the warehouse. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality, especially when it comes to matters of justice." Michael could see his daughter clearly now, could see that she was alive and apparently unharmed. Emma's presence gave him strength even as it made him more vulnerable, more desperate to end this situation safely regardless of the cost to himself. "Let her go, Vincent," Michael said, his voice steady despite the fear and rage churning inside him. "This is between you and me. Emma has nothing to do with what happened 5 years ago." Vincent laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "Nothing to do with it. Detective, your daughter has everything to do with it. She's the thing you love most in this world, just like Maria was the thing I loved most in mine. You took Maria away from me, and now I'm going to take Emma away from you." Chapter 5, The Price of Justice. The conversation between Michael and Vincent quickly revealed the depth of Vincent's pain and the futility of trying to reason with someone consumed by grief and rage. Vincent blamed Michael not just for his imprisonment, but for every bad thing that had happened to his family as a result of his arrest. In Vincent's mind, Michael was responsible for Maria's death, for the destruction of their family's financial stability, and for the 5 years of Vincent's life that had been lost to incarceration. Michael tried to explain that Vincent's drug dealing had caused similar pain to dozens of other families, that the teenagers who had become addicted to Vincent's heroin had sisters and brothers and parents who loved them just as much as Vincent had loved Maria. But Vincent refused to accept any responsibility for the harm his actions had caused, seeing himself only as a victim of an unjust system that had destroyed his life. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with Vincent alternating between rage and self-pity while Michael tried desperately to find some way to save Emma's life. Michael offered to trade places with his daughter, to let Vincent kill him in exchange for Emma's freedom. But Vincent wanted more than just Michael's death. He wanted Michael to experience the same helplessness and loss that Vincent had felt when Maria died alone and afraid. Emma, despite her terror, tried to reason with Vincent herself, drawing on her social work training to connect with his pain while also trying to help him understand that killing her and her father wouldn't bring Maria back or heal the wounds that were driving his quest for revenge. Emma's compassion and intelligence were evident even in this desperate situation, and for a moment, Vincent seemed touched by her genuine concern for his suffering. But Vincent's pain was too deep and his anger too consuming for reason or compassion to reach him. He had spent 5 years planning this revenge, 5 years nursing his hatred for Michael Hayes and fantasizing about the moment when he would make the detective pay for destroying his life. No amount of logic or empathy was going to dissuade him from carrying out the plan that had sustained him through his imprisonment. The confrontation reached its climax when Vincent, growing impatient with the conversation, decided to demonstrate his seriousness by threatening Emma directly. He produced a knife and moved toward her, intending to harm her just enough to show Michael that his threats were real. This was the moment Michael had been dreading and preparing for, the moment when words would no longer be enough to protect his daughter. Chapter 6, The Ultimate Sacrifice. Michael's training and instincts took over as Vincent approached Emma with the knife. There was no time for negotiation or strategy. Vincent was clearly preparing to hurt Emma, and Michael couldn't allow that to happen regardless of the consequences to himself. Michael drew his weapon and ordered Vincent to stop, but Vincent was beyond listening to commands or threats. What happened next unfolded with the terrible speed and chaos that characterizes life or death confrontations. Vincent, realizing that his plan was falling apart, made a desperate lunge toward Emma with the knife. Michael fired his weapon, striking Vincent but not stopping him immediately. Emma, showing remarkable presence of mind despite her terror, managed to tip her chair over and roll away from Vincent's attack. Vincent, wounded but still dangerous, turned his attention from Emma to Michael, charging across the warehouse floor with the knife raised. Michael fired again, but Vincent's momentum carried him forward, and the two men collided in a violent struggle that would determine who lived and who died in this abandoned monument to American industrial decline. The fight between Michael and Vincent was brief but brutal, two men driven by love and hatred fighting for the right to determine Emma's fate. Michael's police training and experience gave him advantages in hand-to-hand combat, but Vincent's rage and desperation made him unpredictably dangerous. In the end, Michael's determination to save his daughter proved stronger than Vincent's desire for revenge. Vincent Carrera died on the warehouse floor, his 5-year quest for vengeance ending in failure and tragedy. But Michael Hayes was mortally wounded in the struggle, his body broken by Vincent's knife even as he succeeded in protecting Emma from harm. As sirens approached the warehouse, backup that Emma had somehow managed to call during the confrontation, Michael used his remaining strength to untie his daughter and tell her how proud he was of her courage and her compassion. Emma held her father as he died, their roles reversed from all the times he had comforted her during childhood fears and teenage heartbreaks. Michael's last words were about how much he loved Emma and how sorry he was that his work had brought danger into her life. Emma assured him that she understood, that she was proud to be his daughter, and that she would continue the work of helping others that they had both chosen as their life's mission. Chapter 7, The Aftermath of Loss. Emma Hayes survived the warehouse confrontation physically unharmed but emotionally devastated by the loss of her father and the traumatic circumstances of his death. The young woman who had dedicated her life to helping others now found herself struggling with post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, and profound grief that threatened to overwhelm her capacity to function. The media coverage of Michael Hayes' death painted him as a hero who had died protecting his daughter and his community from a dangerous criminal. The Detroit Police Department honored Michael's sacrifice with a funeral that drew law enforcement officers from across the state, and Emma was touched by the outpouring of support from her father's colleagues and from the families he had helped throughout his career. But Emma struggled with the knowledge that her father's death had been caused, at least in part, by her decision to work in a dangerous neighborhood against his initial concerns. She blamed herself for staying late at the community center, for being in a position where Vincent could take her hostage, for creating the situation that had cost her father his life. The rational part of her mind understood that Vincent Carrera was responsible for the violence that had destroyed both their families, but grief and trauma made rational thinking difficult. The community center where Emma had been working when she was kidnapped became a memorial to Michael Hayes, with a scholarship fund established in his name to help at-risk youth pursue education and escape the cycles of violence and poverty that had claimed so many lives. Emma found some comfort in knowing that her father's death had inspired others to continue the work of helping people, but the loss remained a constant ache that colored every aspect of her daily life. Emma's studies in social work took on new meaning after her father's death, as she struggled to understand how trauma and loss could transform people like Vincent Carrera from victims into perpetrators. She began specializing in grief counseling and working with families affected by violence, drawing on her own experience with loss to help others navigate their pain and find ways to heal without seeking revenge. Chapter 8, The Cycle of Pain. Vincent Carrera's death ended his personal quest for revenge, but it didn't end the broader cycle of violence and retribution that had shaped his life and Michael's. Vincent's surviving family members, his mother, his cousins, and his friends from the neighborhood where he had grown up, were left to grapple with their own grief and anger at the circumstances of his death. Some of Vincent's relatives blamed Michael Hayes for Vincent's transformation from a young man trying to help his addicted sister into a violent criminal consumed by hatred. They argued that the criminal justice system's harsh approach to drug dealing had destroyed Vincent's life and ultimately led to the warehouse confrontation that claimed both men's lives. In their view, Michael's dedication to law enforcement had created the very violence that had killed him. Others in Vincent's community saw his death as a cautionary tale about the futility of seeking revenge and the way that violence begets more violence. Vincent's mother, devastated by the loss of both her children to drug-related violence, became an advocate for addiction treatment and criminal justice reform, arguing that her son might have lived if he had received help dealing with his grief and anger instead of being left to plan revenge during 5 years in prison. Emma found herself caught between these competing narratives about her father's life and death. She understood the anger and pain of Vincent's family, recognizing that they were experiencing the same kind of devastating loss that she was dealing with. At the same time, she couldn't accept the idea that her father was responsible for Vincent's choices or that Michael's dedication to protecting others had somehow caused the tragedy that claimed both their lives. The complexity of these competing perspectives forced Emma to confront difficult questions about justice, revenge, and the possibility of breaking cycles of violence that seemed to perpetuate themselves across generations. Her social work training had taught her that hurt people often hurt people, that trauma creates more trauma, and that healing requires understanding rather than judgment. But applying these principles to her own situation was far more difficult than discussing them in academic settings. Chapter 9, Finding Purpose in Pain. 2 years after her father's death, Emma made the difficult decision to return to the community center where she had been kidnapped. The building had been renovated and expanded using donations made in Michael's memory, and it now offered comprehensive services including addiction counseling, job training, and family support programs. Emma's return was both a personal challenge and a professional opportunity to continue the work that had brought meaning to both her life and her father's. Working with at-risk youth who had been affected by violence and trauma, Emma found that her own experience with loss gave her a unique ability to connect with young people who might otherwise be skeptical of help from authority figures or social workers. She could speak authentically about the pain of losing someone to violence, about the temptation to seek revenge, and about the importance of finding healthy ways to process grief and anger. Emma's work at the community center brought her into contact with teenagers who reminded her of Vincent Carrera, young people who had lost family members to violence or incarceration and were struggling with anger and resentment that could easily transform into dangerous behavior. She tried to help these youth understand that their pain was valid but that acting on their anger would only create more victims and more grieving families. The most challenging aspect of Emma's work was helping young people understand the difference between justice and revenge. Many of the teenagers she worked with had been taught by their experiences that the world was fundamentally unfair, that good people suffered while bad people prospered, and that the only way to address wrongs was through retaliation. Emma had to find ways to validate their anger while helping them see that revenge only perpetuated cycles of violence that destroyed communities. Emma's approach was shaped by her understanding that both her father and Vincent Carrera had been motivated by love, Michael's love for his daughter and Vincent's love for his sister. She helped young people recognize that love could be a force for healing and positive change rather than a justification for violence and destruction. This message wasn't always well received, especially by teenagers who had experienced significant trauma, but Emma persisted in believing that even the most hurt and angry young people could choose different paths. Chapter 10: The Long Road to Healing. Emma's healing process was complicated by the fact that she had to deal with her trauma while also helping others process their own experiences with violence and loss. Working with grieving families and traumatized youth forced her to confront her own pain on a daily basis, but it also provided her with a sense of purpose that helped her find meaning in her father's death. The third anniversary of Michael's death was particularly difficult for Emma, marking the passage of enough time that the initial shock and numbness had worn off, leaving behind a deep sadness that seemed to have settled permanently into her bones. She had learned to function despite her grief, to maintain professional relationships and help her clients effectively, but the joy and optimism that had once characterized her personality seemed to have died with her father in that warehouse. Emma began attending grief counseling herself, recognizing that she couldn't continue helping others heal if she wasn't addressing her own trauma. The counseling sessions were painful, forcing her to confront not just her sadness about losing her father, but also her anger at Vincent Carrera, her guilt about surviving when her father didn't, and her fear that her commitment to helping others would eventually lead to more tragedy. Through counseling and the support of colleagues and friends, Emma gradually began to understand that healing from trauma didn't mean forgetting what had happened or returning to the person she had been before the warehouse confrontation. Instead, healing meant learning to carry her grief and her love for her father in ways that honored his memory while allowing her to continue living a meaningful life. Emma also began to explore her complicated feelings about Vincent Carrera, moving beyond simple hatred to a more nuanced understanding of how trauma and loss had shaped his choices. This didn't mean forgiving Vincent for what he had done, but it did mean recognizing him as a human being who had been destroyed by grief rather than simply a monster who had killed her father. This understanding helped Emma work more effectively with clients who were struggling with their own anger and desire for revenge. Chapter 11: Legacy of Love and Service. As Emma entered her 5th year of working at the community center named in her father's memory, she began to see concrete evidence that their work was making a difference in young people's lives. Former clients returned to share news of their graduations, their jobs, their families, and their decisions to choose legal paths despite the challenges they faced. These success stories didn't erase the pain of losing her father, but they provided Emma with proof that Michael's sacrifice had contributed to positive change. The community center had become a model for similar programs throughout Detroit and other cities struggling with violence and poverty. Emma found herself traveling to conferences and speaking to other social workers, law enforcement officers, and community leaders about the importance of addressing trauma and grief before they could transform into violence and revenge. Her unique perspective as both a victim of violence and a professional helper gave her presentations particular power and authenticity. Emma's work had also attracted the attention of researchers studying the intergenerational transmission of trauma and violence. She participated in studies examining how individuals and communities could break cycles of retribution, contributing to academic knowledge while also learning more about the factors that had shaped both her father's and Vincent Carrera's choices. This research helped Emma understand her own experience within broader patterns of American urban violence and community resilience. The scholarship fund established in Michael's memory had grown significantly, providing educational opportunities for dozens of young people who might otherwise have been unable to afford college or vocational training. Emma served on the scholarship committee, helping to select recipients and mentor them through their educational journeys. Many of the scholarship recipients went on to careers in social work, law enforcement, education, and other fields focused on helping others. Emma never married or had children, feeling that her calling was to serve as a surrogate parent and mentor to the countless young people who came through the community center's doors. She often wondered what her father would think of the choices she had made, whether he would approve of her decision to continue working in dangerous neighborhoods despite the risks. But Emma believed that honoring Michael's memory meant continuing his commitment to protecting and serving others, even when that service came with significant personal costs. Chapter 12, The Continuing Journey. 10 years after the warehouse confrontation that claimed her father's life, Emma Hayes had become a nationally recognized expert on trauma-informed community intervention and the prevention of revenge-based violence. She had written a book about her experiences, appeared on television programs discussing urban violence, and consulted with law enforcement agencies about building better relationships with the communities they served. Despite her professional success, Emma remained haunted by questions about whether different choices might have prevented the tragedy that shaped her life. She wondered if Vincent Carrera might have found healing instead of revenge if he had received better support during his incarceration, if her father might have lived if she had made different decisions about where and when to work, if the cycles of violence plaguing American cities could ever truly be broken. Emma's work had taught her that there are no simple answers to these questions, that violence and trauma create complex webs of cause and effect that resist easy solutions. But she had also learned that individuals and communities can choose to respond to trauma with compassion rather than revenge, with healing rather than retaliation, and with hope rather than despair. The community center continued to serve hundreds of young people each year, providing them with alternatives to the streets and helping them develop the skills and resilience they needed to build better lives. Emma took pride in knowing that her father's death had contributed to this ongoing work of transformation and healing, even as she continued to miss him terribly and wish that he could have seen the positive changes his sacrifice had inspired. As Emma looked toward the future, she remained committed to the work that had brought meaning to both her life and her father's death. The snow still fell each winter over Detroit, covering the city in white that obscured but could not eliminate the scars left by decades of violence and economic decline. But Emma had learned to see beauty and hope in the snow, recognizing it as a reminder that even the harshest winters eventually give way to spring, and that healing and renewal remain possible even in the aftermath of the most devastating tragedies. The legacy of Michael Hayes lived on in his daughter's work, in the young people whose lives were changed by the programs created in his memory, and in the understanding that love and service could triumph over hatred and revenge, even when that triumph came at the ultimate price. Emma carried her father's memory with her each day, drawing strength from his example and continuing the work of building a more just and compassionate world, one person at a time.